Somewhere in America right now, a state government is spending more to keep one person locked in a cell for a year than it would cost to send that same person to Harvard. Not County College. Harvard. In several states, the average annual cost of housing a single prisoner now exceeds $60,000, and in Massachusetts, it's climbed above $300,000. That number sounds like a mistake. It isn't. And once you understand where that money actually goes, you start to realize that a prison isn't really a punishment machine. It's one of the strangest, most expensive service businesses in the country, one that never turns away a customer, can't choose its clientele, and is legally required to keep every single person inside alive, fed, and medically treated, no matter the cost. So why is it so expensive to simply keep someone behind a wall? And who exactly is getting paid? Let's define what we're actually talking about. A prison is a secure facility run by a government or on behalf of a government to hold people who have been convicted of crimes, as distinct from a jail, which typically holds people awaiting trial or serving short sentences. In the United States, more than 1 million people are held in state and federal prisons, and the country spends somewhere north of $80 billion a year running these systems. That number covers thousands of facilities, hundreds of thousands of correctional employees, and a supply chain of over 4,000 vendors selling everything from industrial kitchen equipment to prescription medication to the government agencies that run them. Ownership is mostly public. The vast majority of prisons in America are operated directly by state departments of corrections or the Federal Bureau of Prisons, funded through general tax revenue the same way public schools or highway departments are. But a meaningful slice of the system, particularly in immigration detention, is run by private companies under contract. And that distinction is going to matter a lot later in this story. Why does the system exist in its current form, with thousands of physically separate, heavily staffed facilities rather than some more centralized model? Because incarceration, by law, requires close supervision, and supervision doesn't scale the way a factory does. You can't automate a cell block. Every additional inmate requires additional staff hours, additional meals, additional medical capacity, and additional square footage, which is exactly why this industry behaves less like a typical business and more like a public utility with a security perimeter around it. So what does it actually take to build one of these facilities from the ground up? A new medium security state prison, holding somewhere in the range of 1 to 2,000 inmates, can cost anywhere from $100 million to several $100 million to construct, depending on security level and region. That figure includes reinforced perimeter fencing or walls, guard towers, secure housing units, industrial kitchens capable of preparing thousands of meals a day, a medical wing equivalent to a small hospital, laundry facilities, visitation areas, and increasingly classrooms and vocational workshops for rehabilitation programming. Higher security facilities cost significantly more because of reinforced construction, more elaborate surveillance systems, and lower inmate-to-staff ratios. Beyond construction, a prison needs licensing and accreditation from state corrections oversight bodies, compliance systems for federal standards around inmate treatment, and enormous upfront investment in staffing infrastructure, because unlike a factory that can be built and then largely left to machines, a prison is fundamentally a labor-intensive operation from the day it opens. You are, in effect, building a small city that never closes, complete with its own power needs, water and sewage demands, and food logistics, except every single resident is legally barred from leaving. Now, where does the money to run all of this actually come from? The obvious answer is government appropriations. State legislatures and Congress allocate corrections budgets annually, funded by general tax revenue, and departments of corrections then distribute that money across facilities based largely on population and security classification. This is the visible revenue stream, and it's enormous, more than $60 billion a year at the state level alone. But there's a second, much less visible layer of money moving through this system. Many prisons generate internal revenue through commissary sales, marked up prices on snacks, hygiene products, and basic necessities sold to inmates, often through exclusive contracts with private vendors. Phone and video call services for inmates to contact family have historically been priced at rates far above normal consumer telecom pricing, generating revenue that gets split between the vendor and, in many states, the corrections department itself through commission agreements. Prison labor programs, where inmates work for extremely low wages, sometimes cents per hour, producing goods or providing services either for the prison system itself or for outside companies through the federal UNICER program and its state equivalents, represent another quiet revenue stream. And for the private prison industry specifically, the real money isn't in state prison contracts at all anymore. It's in federal immigration detention, where companies are paid a daily rate per detained person, sometimes cited around $165 a day, and where that per diem model means more detainees translate directly into more revenue, creating a financial incentive structure that looks nothing like a traditional public service. This is the uncomfortable core of the private prison business model, and we'll come back to it. For now, understand that hidden revenue streams, commissary markups, phone contracts, and per diem detention payments are often proportionally more profitable than the base government contract itself, because they carry far higher margins than simply housing and feeding someone. Now let's talk about where all that money goes, because operating costs in this industry are relentless and largely unavoidable. Staffing dominates everything. Correctional officer salaries, overtime, and benefits typically consume the majority of a prison's operating budget, sometimes more than two-thirds of it. The national median salary for a correctional officer sits around $58,000 a year, though that varies enormously by state, from the mid-30s in Mississippi to well over $90,000 in California. Because prisons must be staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, chronic understaffing forces existing officers into expensive overtime shifts, which paradoxically makes short-staffed prisons more expensive to run per capita, not less. Then comes healthcare, which has become one of the fastest-growing cost categories in corrections. The incarcerated population skews toward chronic illness, substance use disorders, and mental health conditions, and courts have repeatedly ruled that prisons have a constitutional obligation to provide adequate medical care regardless of cost. An aging prison population, driven by decades of long sentences, means more inmates now require expensive geriatric and chronic disease care, essentially forcing prisons to also function as underfunded nursing homes. Food service, while smaller in total dollars, has to feed the entire population 3 times a day, every day without exception, and rising food costs hit prison budgets just as directly as they hit grocery bills. Facility maintenance is another quiet drain. Many state prisons were built decades ago, and aging plumbing, electrical systems, and security infrastructure require constant, expensive upkeep, not unlike the aging infrastructure problems you'd find in any old public building, except failure here can mean a security breach rather than just an inconvenience. This is why a prison can have a seemingly enormous budget and still be functionally broke. Costs scale directly with population and are largely fixed regardless of efficiency gains. Staffing is expensive and difficult to cut without triggering safety and legal problems, and healthcare and aging infrastructure costs tend to rise faster than general inflation. Overcrowding makes this worse, not better, since packing more people into a facility built for a smaller population increases healthcare strain, security risk, and staffing needs all at once, without proportionally increasing efficiency. So what happens when this financial pressure boils over? Courts have intervened directly in some of the most severe cases. In California, decades of overcrowding led to a landmark Supreme Court ruling in 2011, Brown v. Plata, which found that conditions in California's prisons violated the constitutional prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment and ordered the state to dramatically reduce its prison population. That single ruling forced a fundamental restructuring of how California handled sentencing and incarceration, shifting tens of thousands of people into county-level supervision and alternative programs almost overnight. It's a stark example of how a financial and operational failure, decades of underinvestment paired with tough sentencing laws that filled facilities faster than the state could expand them, eventually became a constitutional crisis with enormous budgetary consequences. Private prisons carry a different kind of risk, contract and reputational risk. Because private operators are paid per inmate, their profitability depends on maintaining occupancy, which has led critics to argue the model creates a structural incentive to support policies that increase incarceration or detention rather than reduce it. One of the most notorious illustrations of this incentive problem wasn't even a private prison company directly, but 2 judges in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, who in the mid-2000s were convicted of accepting more than $2 million in kickbacks from the builders of private juvenile detention facilities in exchange for sentencing children to those facilities, a scandal that came to be known as Kids for Cash. It remains one of the starkest cautionary tales in the industry's history about what can happen when financial incentives and sentencing decisions become entangled. The financial picture for the 2 largest publicly traded private prison companies in the country, CoreCivic and the GEO Group, tells the rest of this story. Together they've generated combined annual revenue exceeding $4.5 billion, and both companies have seen sharp increases in profit tied specifically to expanded federal immigration detention contracts, with GEO Group alone reporting roughly $2.6 billion in revenue in a recent year, driven largely by growth in that segment. Today, the overwhelming majority of detained immigrants in the United States, cited in some analyses at around 90%, are held in privately operated facilities. On earnings calls, executives at both companies have described current conditions as an unusually favorable business environment, directly tying their financial performance to detention population growth. Whether that arrangement represents efficient public-private partnership or a troubling alignment of profit motive with human confinement is one of the most contested debates in American criminal justice policy, and reasonable people land in very different places on it. Supporters argue private operators can build and staff facilities faster and sometimes cheaper than government agencies burdened by procurement rules. Critics argue that research comparing cost and quality between public and private facilities has produced mixed and inconclusive results at best, and that a profit motive attached to human incarceration creates incentives that are fundamentally at odds with the goal of reducing incarceration over time. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum sits rehabilitation, the part of the system that costs relatively little compared to security and healthcare, but which research consistently shows offers some of the best long-term financial returns. Vocational training, substance abuse treatment, and education programs, including GED and college coursework, cost a fraction of what a year of incarceration costs. Yet studies from organizations like the RAND Corporation have found that inmates who participate in these programs are significantly less likely to reoffend after release. That matters enormously for the underlying economics, because recidivism is the hidden multiplier on every dollar spent on corrections. A system that fails to rehabilitate doesn't just fail morally, it fails financially, generating repeat customers who cycle back through an extraordinarily expensive system again and again. Looking forward, the industry is being pulled in two directions at once. State prison populations have generally declined over the past decade as many states have pursued sentencing reform, reduced penalties for lower-level drug offenses, and expanded alternatives like probation and electronic monitoring, all of which are dramatically cheaper than incarceration. At the same time, federal immigration detention has expanded sharply, becoming the primary growth engine for the private detention industry, even as the broader use of private prisons for ordinary state and federal offenders has leveled off or declined. Technology is reshaping both sides of this equation. Electronic ankle monitoring and GPS-based supervision now allow some lower-risk offenders to serve sentences outside a facility entirely, at a small fraction of the cost of incarceration, and several jurisdictions are experimenting with data-driven risk assessment tools to help judges make more consistent sentencing and parole decisions, though these tools remain controversial over concerns about embedded bias. Automation is unlikely to replace correctional staff anytime soon, since supervision of people is fundamentally a human task, but it is increasingly used for surveillance, contraband detection, and administrative efficiency. So here's the honest answer to the question this documentary opened with. A prison system's economics succeed in the narrow financial sense when population size, staffing levels, and facility conditions stay roughly in balance, and when investment in things like healthcare infrastructure and rehabilitation programming keeps pace with the population's actual needs rather than being treated as the first thing cut when budgets tighten. It fails expensively and sometimes catastrophically when any one of those pieces falls badly out of sync with the others, when sentencing laws fill facilities faster than states are willing to fund them, when private incentives reward occupancy over outcomes, or when decades of deferred investment in aging buildings and understaffed wards collide all at once with a federal court order. The real lesson buried in these numbers isn't really about prisons at all. It's about what happens when a government commits to providing a service it legally cannot refuse to anyone, cannot ration, and cannot simply shut down when the bill comes due. Unlike almost every other industry in this world, a prison can't lose customers, and only lose control of the cost of keeping them.